The moment Clara Whitmore stepped off the stagecoach in Pine Hollow, Oregon, Edwin Hale's face went white as fresh-cut pine. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to become his bride, carried his letters against her heart through every dusty mile. But now, standing before him in the autumn sun of 1886, she watched his eyes travel up, 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 her full 6 feet of height, and saw something die in his expression. "This won't do," he said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear. "This won't do at all." He turned his back and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the town square with nothing but a carpetbag and the sound of whispers rising like smoke around her. Thank you for joining Clara's journey. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far her courage travels. Now, let's begin where everything changed. The stagecoach wheels had barely stopped turning when Clara knew something was wrong. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times during the 3-week journey west. The way Edwin would smile when he saw her, perhaps take her hand, welcome her to her new home with the warmth his letters had promised. Instead, she watched through the dusty window as a tall, well-dressed man approached the coach, his confident stride faltering the moment the driver opened the door. Clara gathered her skirts and stepped down, her practice movements graceful despite her height. She'd learned long ago how to carry herself with dignity, how to make her unusual stature seem deliberate rather than awkward. The autumn air of Pine Hollow smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, so different from Boston's coal and sea salt. "Mr. Hale?" She kept her voice steady, warm, extending her gloved hand. Edwin Hale stood perhaps 5 feet 9 inches tall. His face, handsome in the photograph he'd sent, now wore an expression of poorly concealed horror. He didn't take her hand. Around them, townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the arrival of the coach and the news that had spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. Their mill owner was collecting his mail-order bride. "You didn't mention," Edwin's voice carried across the square. "In your letters, you never said that I'm tall?" Clara finished for him, lowering her hand. She felt the familiar shame trying to creep up her spine, but she forced it down. "I wrote that I was of unusual height, Mr. Hale, in my 3rd letter." "Unusual?" Edwin laughed, but there was no humor in it. Several men in the crowd chuckled along with him. "That's one word for it." An older woman in a severe black dress whispered loudly to her companion, "Like a circus attraction." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her chin level. She'd spent 28 years being too tall, too much, too different. She'd endured the stares in Boston, the cruel jokes from potential suitors, the pitying looks from married women. Edwin's letters had seemed different. He'd written about needing a capable woman, someone strong enough for frontier life, someone who valued character over convention. She'd been a fool. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, aware of every eye upon them, "I've traveled a very long way. Perhaps we might speak privately?" "There's nothing to speak about." Edwin's voice was firm, final. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather purse. "The return fare to Portland with something extra for your trouble. The southbound stage comes through on Friday." He held out the money, and Clara stared at it. 3 days in Pine Hollow, then back to Boston in defeat. Back to her sister's cramped apartment, back to sewing in the dim light, until her eyes ached. Back to being invisible, except when she was too visible. "I don't want your money," she heard herself say. Edwin's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon?" "I said I don't want your money." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "I came here in good faith, Mr. Hale. Your letters painted a picture of a town that needed capable hands, of a life being built in new territory where what mattered was strength and character. I believed you." "Be reasonable." "I am being reasonable." Clara felt something shifting inside her, some fundamental refusal to shrink anymore. "I've spent my savings to come here. I have skills. I'm an excellent seamstress. I can read and cipher. I've managed household accounts. I may not be what you expected, but I'm also not going to run back east because you lack the courage your letters promised." The crowd had gone quiet. Edwin's face flushed red. "You can't possibly think you'll stay here. There's no place for someone like you." "Then I'll make a place." Edwin stared at her for a long moment, and she saw calculation in his eyes, weighing his reputation against the embarrassment of this public rejection. Finally, he tucked his money purse away. "Do what you like," he said coldly, "but don't expect any assistance from me." He turned and walked toward a fine painted carriage waiting at the edge of the square, his boots clicking authoritatively against the wooden sidewalk. The driver flicked the reins and the carriage rolled away, leaving Clara standing alone with her carpetbag, surrounded by staring strangers. The silence stretched like taffy. Then, slowly, people began to disperse, their whispers creating a low buzz of gossip that would feed Pine Hollow for weeks. Clara stood very still, afraid that if she moved, the fragile composure holding her together would shatter. "You'll be needing a place to stay, I expect." The voice belonged to a woman perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that assessed Clara with surprising neutrality. She wore a simple calico dress and a canvas apron, and her hands were red and work-worn. "Yes," Clara managed, "though I'm not sure where—" "Mrs. Brennan's boarding house." The woman pointed toward a 2-story structure down the main street. "She's particular about her tenants, but she's fair. Name's Agnes Morton. I run the dry goods store." She nodded toward a shop across the square. "You say you can sew?" "Yes, ma'am. I worked in a dressmaker's shop in Boston for 10 years. Agnes's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened with interest. "We've got no proper seamstress in Pine Hollow. Women make do themselves or order from Portland, which takes weeks and costs dear. You might find work if you've a mind to stay." "I have a mind to," Clara said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "Then you'd best come along. Maggie Brennan will want to look you over before she decides." Agnes started walking, clearly expecting Clara to follow. "Fair warning, she'll ask questions, direct ones." Clara picked up her carpetbag and followed. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to walk with her head high. People watched from windows and doorways, their curiosity naked and unashamed. She caught fragments of conversation. "Never seen a woman so tall. What was Hale thinking? Won't last a week." Agnes led her down Main Street, past the general store, a small bank, a saloon already doing brisk afternoon business, and what appeared to be a land office. Pine Hollow was larger than Clara had expected. The logging industry clearly brought prosperity. The buildings were well maintained, many painted in cheerful colors despite the raw frontier setting. Beyond the town, dark forests of Douglas fir and cedar crowded close, and the distant sound of saws and falling timber provided a constant backdrop. The boarding house stood at the quieter end of Main Street, a neat 2-story structure with a wide porch and lace curtains in every window. A sign hung from the eave, "Brennan's Rooms, respectable tenants only." Agnes knocked firmly, then entered without waiting for an answer. "Maggie, got someone for you to meet." The interior was scrupulously clean, with polished wood floors and the smell of beeswax and bread. A woman emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, shorter than Agnes, rounder, with kind brown eyes and a face creased by both worry and laughter. She wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron, then stopped short when she saw Clara. "Mother Mary," she breathed. "Agnes, who—" "This is Clara Whitmore," Agnes said briskly. "Came in on the stage as Edwin Hale's intended." He took one look at her and ran like his pants were on fire. Maggie Brennan's expression shifted from surprise to something like sympathy. "I heard the commotion from here. Whole town's buzzing about it." She studied Clara frankly. "You're quite tall, aren't you?" Clara had learned that there was no good way to respond to such observations. "Yes, ma'am. And you're staying in Pine Hollow, despite Hale's foolishness?" "I am." "Why?" The question was simple, direct, and Clara realized she didn't have a simple answer. Because going back felt like dying. Because she'd staked everything on this chance and couldn't bear to admit defeat. Because for the first time in her life, she'd been angry enough to refuse to disappear. "Because I have nowhere else to be," she finally said, and it was the truest thing she could offer. Maggie and Agnes exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. Then Maggie nodded. "I've got a room on the 2nd floor. Front-facing, gets good light. $3 a week, includes breakfast and supper. You'll need to keep it tidy and be respectful of the other boarders. No men in your room, no drinking, and you're expected at meals on time." "I can pay for 2 weeks now," Clara said, reaching for the small purse she kept hidden in her skirt pocket. After that, I'll need to find work. Agnes says, you sew? Yes, ma'am. I have references from Boston. Letters won't mean much here, Maggie interrupted, but not unkindly. Can you show me? Clara set down her carpetbag and began unbuttoning her traveling jacket. I made this entire outfit myself. The jacket, the skirt, the blouse. The fabric is from Boston, but I did the tailoring. Both women examined her clothing with the practical eyes of women who knew quality when they saw it. The jacket was simple but beautifully fitted, with careful darts that accommodated Clara's height without excess fabric. The stitching was tiny and even. The buttonholes precisely worked, the collar sitting perfectly despite the unconventional proportions. That's fine work, Agnes said. Very fine. Could you make trousers? Maggie asked. The logging camp men are always needing repairs and new clothes. Most of them can barely sew on a button. Clara nodded. I can work with any fabric, cotton, wool, canvas. I can do repairs, alterations, or make new garments from patterns or measurements. Then I expect you'll do well enough, Maggie said. Come on, I'll show you the room. Clara followed her up a narrow staircase that creaked under their feet. The second floor had 4 rooms opening off a central hallway, with a small washroom at the end. Maggie opened the second door on the left, revealing a modest but clean space. A single bed with an iron frame, a small dresser with a mirror, a straight-back chair, and a table under the window. It's perfect, Clara said softly. You'll share the washroom with the other boarders. Right now, that's just Mr. Davis, who works at the mill office, and the Holbrook sisters, who teach at the school. They're all decent folk. Maggie paused. There'll be talk, you understand, about Hale, about you staying. Pine Hollow's a small town. I understand. And men can be difficult about women who don't fit their notion of how things should be. Clara met her eyes. I've been too tall since I was 14 years old, Mrs. Brennan. I know exactly how difficult men can be. Something like respect flickered across Maggie's face. I expect you do. Well then, I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late, or there won't be anything left. The loggers come in hungry. After Maggie left, Clara stood in the center of her new room, feeling the weight of the day finally settling onto her shoulders. She moved to the window and looked out at Pine Hollow, at the dusty street, at the mountains rising dark and massive beyond the town, at the unfamiliar landscape of her uncertain future. She'd meant what she said to Edwin. She had nowhere else to be. But standing here now, alone in a strange town where everyone had witnessed her rejection, she felt the full magnitude of what she'd done. No return ticket, no plan, no friends, nothing but pride and desperation keeping her from collapse. Clara unpacked her carpet bag with careful, deliberate movements, hanging her 2 other dresses in the small wardrobe, arranging her sewing supplies on the table, setting her mother's photograph on the dresser. The familiar rituals steadied her. She'd built a life in Boston from nothing after her parents died. She'd survived her sister's resentment, survived the loneliness, survived year after year of being overlooked and invisible, despite her impossible-to-ignore height. She would survive this too. A knock on the door made her turn. A young woman stood in the hallway, perhaps 20 years old, with blonde hair and braids and warm hazel eyes. I'm Sarah Holbrook, she said. Maggie said you just arrived. I wanted to welcome you and... She hesitated. I wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened with Mr. Hale. The whole town saw it, and it wasn't right. The way he treated you wasn't right. Clara felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Thank you. My sister Emma and I, we teach at the school. If you need anything, if you need to know where things are in town, or if anyone bothers you, you can come find us. I appreciate that, Sarah smiled. Also, I heard you're a seamstress because I've been needing a new dress for months, and there's a social coming up in November, and if you're taking commissions... I am, Clara said, feeling something cautiously like hope. I'd be happy to help. Wonderful. I'll come by tomorrow and we can talk about fabric and designs. Sarah started to leave, then turned back. You know, my sister is nearly 6 feet tall, too. Not quite as tall as you, but close. She's always having trouble with skirts being too short. Could you make alterations? Of course. After Sarah left, Clara returned to the window. The sun was lowering toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the forest, she could hear the rhythmic sound of axes and the distant crash of a falling tree. She'd come to Pine Hollow to disappear into marriage, to trade her independence for the security of being someone's wife. But Edwin's rejection had given her something unexpected, the chance to stay on her own terms. It would be hard. She had no illusions about that. But as she stood in the golden light of her new room, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but possibility. The future was uncertain, frightening even, but it was hers to shape. She would make a place for herself in Pine Hollow, not as Edwin Hale's wife, not as anyone's charity case, but as Clara Whitmore, seamstress, a woman who refused to shrink. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn to the sound of men's voices in the street below. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress and went downstairs, finding the dining room already half full of boarders. Maggie was carrying platters of eggs and biscuits from the kitchen, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Mr. Davis, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, nodded politely when introduced. The Holbrook sisters, Sarah and Emma, who was indeed remarkably tall, welcomed her warmly. The meal passed with quiet conversation, and Clara found herself relaxing slightly into the routine of it. After breakfast, she approached Maggie in the kitchen. "Mrs. Brennan, could you direct me to Agnes Morton's store? I'd like to see about fabric supplies." "Of course. And call me Maggie. Everyone does." She wiped her hands on a towel. "Agnes opens at 8. You'll find her fair but shrewd. Don't let her talk you down on your prices." The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Pine Hollow was already bustling, wagons rumbling past loaded with logs, men heading toward the mill, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts. Clara walked with her head high, aware of the stares but refusing to acknowledge them. Let them look. She had work to do. Agnes Morton's dry goods store was larger than it appeared from outside, crammed floor to ceiling with everything from canned goods to farming tools to bolts of fabric. Agnes herself stood behind the counter, checking inventory in a large ledger. "Miss Whitmore," she said without looking up. "Prompt. That's good." "I wanted to inquire about fabric," Clara said. "If I'm going to sew for the town, I'll need supplies." Agnes closed her ledger and fixed Clara with those sharp blue eyes. "I've got cotton, wool, some canvas suitable for work clothes. The selection isn't what you'd find in Boston, I expect, but it's serviceable. I can order special items from Portland if you give me notice and payment up front." For the next hour, they discussed fabric weights and prices, thread quality, and button supplies. Agnes was indeed shrewd, but Clara had learned the dressmaking trade thoroughly and held her ground on costs. Finally, they reached an agreement. Agnes would extend Clara modest credit for basic supplies to be repaid from her earnings and would advertise Clara's services to customers. "Women will want to see your work before they commit," Agnes warned. "You'd best have samples." "I'll make a display piece," Clara said. "Something that shows different techniques." "Good." Agnes hesitated, then said, "There'll be some who won't give you work, no matter how fine you're sewing, because of Hale, because you're different, because people are small-minded and cruel. Don't take it personal." "I've had practice with that," Clara said quietly. She spent the rest of the morning selecting fabric and supplies, her mind already planning projects. A simple skirt and blouse to show her basic construction skills. Perhaps a man's shirt with detailed work on the collar and cuffs. Something in wool to demonstrate her ability with heavier fabrics. As she was gathering her purchases, the shop door opened and a blast of cold air swept in, carrying with it the smell of pine and sweat. Clara looked up and found herself staring at a man's chest, then had to look up further to see his face. He stood perhaps 6 feet 4 inches tall, broad-shouldered and solid, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that held a kind of quiet wariness. His clothes were work-worn, canvas trousers, a wool shirt, heavy boots, and his hands were scarred and calloused. He carried himself with the careful economy of movement common to men who worked with dangerous tools. "Morning, Agnes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Need to order supplies for the upper camp. Winter's coming early, and we're low on—" He stopped, noticing Clara. "Pardon me, ma'am. Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting, Jonah," Agnes said. "This is Miss Whitmore. She's going to be doing sewing and tailoring in town. Miss Whitmore, this is Jonah Calder. He runs the lumber camp up near Widow's Peak." Ma'am. Jonah touched his hat brim, polite but not particularly interested. He turned back to Agnes. Like I was saying, we need… Mr. Calder, Clara heard herself say. Do the men in your camp need clothing repairs? I'm establishing my services and would be happy to work with canvas and wool. Jonah looked at her again, more carefully this time. His gaze traveled over her height, but without the shock or disgust she'd seen in Edwin's eyes. It was more like assessment, the way he might look at a tree to judge its soundness. They might, he said slowly. Most of the boys are hard on their clothes. But the camp's a half-day's ride from here, and the work would need to be done quickly when they're in town. I can work quickly. She's good, Jonah, Agnes put in. I've seen her stitching, fine as anything from Portland. Jonah considered this. Tell you what, Miss Whitmore, next time the crew comes into town, that'll be 2 weeks from now. I'll send them your way if you're serious about working canvas and heavy wool. Fair enough? More than fair, Clara said. Thank you. He nodded and returned to his business with Agnes, reeling off a list of supplies that suggested he was responsible for dozens of men in rough conditions. Clara listened as she gathered her purchases, learning that Jonah's camp was one of 3 operating in the hills above Pine Hollow, that his crew was considered the most reliable and safest, and that he'd been working these forests for nearly a decade. When Agnes finished taking his order, Jonah touched his hat to both women and left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Don't get ideas, Agnes said dryly after he'd gone. Clara looked at her in surprise. I beg your pardon? I see that look on women's faces around Jonah Calder. He's tall, he's respected, he makes good money, but he keeps to himself and his work. Hasn't shown interest in courting anyone in the 5 years I've known him. I wasn't… Clara felt her face heat. I was simply being professional. Agnes didn't sound convinced. Just so you know, half the unmarried women in Pine Hollow have tried to catch his eye. He's polite about it, but he's not interested. That's fine with me, Clara said firmly. I didn't come here looking for a husband. That worked out poorly enough already. Agnes's expression softened slightly. Fair point. Well, you'd best get back to Maggie's and start on those samples. Time's wasting. Clara carried her supplies back through town, her arms full of fabric and her mind already working through patterns and techniques. She was so focused on her plans that she nearly collided with a man stepping out of the saloon. Watch yourself, he said sharply, then his eyes widened. Well now, you're that woman from yesterday, Hale's rejected bride. Clara stepped back, recognition prickling. She'd seen this man in the crowd during her rejection. He'd been one of those who laughed. Excuse me, she said, trying to move around him. He shifted to block her path. What's your hurry? I'm just being friendly. His breath smelled of whiskey despite the early hour. Name's Tom Russell. I work at Hale's Mill. Good day, Mr. Russell. Clara kept her voice flat, emotionless. Now don't be like that. I was thinking, since Hale don't want you, maybe you're available for other arrangements. His smile was ugly. A woman alone in a logging town, she's got to be practical, right? Heat flooded Clara's face. Step aside, now. Or what? You'll tell on me? Russell laughed. Who's going to care what happens to Edwin Hale's leftover? Is there a problem here? The voice came from behind Clara, deep and calm, but carrying an edge of steel. She turned to find Jonah Calder standing in the street, his gray eyes fixed on Russell with an expression that made the smaller man step back. No problem, Calder, Russell said quickly. Just having a conversation. Looked like harassment from where I stood. Jonah moved closer, and Clara realized that his size, which had seemed merely notable before, could be genuinely intimidating when he wanted it to be. Miss Whitmore's trying to conduct her business. You're in her way. Russell's face reddened. Since when do you care about… Since now. Jonah's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Russell close his mouth. Move along, Tom. For a moment, Clara thought Russell might argue. Then he muttered something under his breath and slouched back toward the saloon, his shoulders hunched with anger. Jonah turned to Clara. You all right, ma'am? Yes. Thank you. Clara's hands were shaking slightly, and she tightened her grip on her fabric bundles to hide it. I appreciate your intervention. Wasn't anything. But his eyes followed Russell until the man disappeared through the saloon doors. Tom Russell's got a mean streak when he drinks. Best to steer clear of him. I'll remember that. Jonah looked at her laden arms. You need help carrying that? No, I'm quite capable. Clara stopped herself. She was capable, but she was also struggling with the weight, and pride was a poor substitute for practical help. Actually, yes, if you wouldn't mind. Something that might have been surprise crossed Jonah's face, but he simply took the two heaviest bundles from her without comment. They walked together back toward the boarding house, and Clara found herself acutely aware of the picture they must make. Two unusually tall people moving through town together, drawing stares from every direction. Agnes said you run a lumber camp, she said, more to fill the silence than anything. That's right. Widow's Peak Camp, up in the high country. Is it difficult work? Jonah glanced at her, and she saw a flicker of something like amusement in his eyes. That's like asking if winter's cold, ma'am. It's logging. Everything about it's difficult. Despite herself, Clara smiled. I suppose that was a foolish question. Not foolish, just city-born. He said it without judgment, simply stating a fact. You never worked around timber? Never. Boston isn't known for its forests. Why'd you come west, if you don't mind my asking? The question was direct but not intrusive, and Clara found herself answering honestly. Because I thought I'd found someone who valued capability over appearance. I was wrong, obviously. His loss, Jonah said simply. They'd reached the boarding house. Jonah set down the fabric bundles on the porch with careful precision, then touched his hat. You take care, Miss Whitmore. And if Russell or anyone else bothers you again, you come find me or report it to Sheriff Morrison. Don't try to handle it alone. Why would you help me? The question came out before Clara could stop it. You don't know me. Jonah looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes thoughtful. I know what it's like to not fit, he said finally. Different reasons, maybe, but same result. Town like this, you either make space for people who don't fit the mold, or you drive out anyone with any grit or backbone. He paused. Seems to me Pine Hollow could use more grit and less judgment. Before Clara could respond, he turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street. She stood on the porch, watching him go, and felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though she couldn't deny he was striking. It was more like recognition. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, she'd met someone who looked at her and saw a person rather than a problem. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in that moment it felt like everything. Clara picked up her bundles and went inside, ready to begin building the life she'd claimed for herself. One stitch at a time, one day at a time, until she stood as firmly in Pine Hollow as those ancient trees stood in the surrounding forests. Unshakable, undeniable, exactly as tall as she was meant to be. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of needle and thread. Clara worked from dawn until her fingers cramped, creating samples that would prove her skill to Pine Hollow's skeptical residents. She made a walking skirt in deep green wool with invisible hems and perfect pleating, a man's work shirt with reinforced seams and precise collar points, and a child's dress with delicate smocking across the bodice. Each piece was a statement, a declaration of worth stitched into fabric. Sarah Holbrook became her first official customer, commissioning a dress for the November social in a shade of blue that matched her eyes. Emma followed, ordering 2 skirts with the extra length she could never find in ready-made garments. Word spread slowly, cautiously, through the network of women who gathered at Agnes Morton's store and Maggie Brennan's kitchen table. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the woman Edwin Hale had rejected. Others came because they genuinely needed Clara's skills. She learned to tell the difference in the first 30 seconds of conversation. The set of the shoulders, the tone of the greeting, whether they met her eyes or stared at her height. Mrs. Patricia Winters, the banker's wife, arrived at the boarding house on Clara's 5th day in Pine Hollow. She swept into the small room with the air of someone doing charity work, her expensive dress rustling with each movement. I've heard you sew, she said without preamble. I need alterations on 3-day dresses. The seamstress in Portland has become impossibly expensive. Clara set aside the shirt she'd been mending. I'd be happy to help. May I see the garments? Mrs. Winters gestured to her maid, who carried in an armful of beautiful dresses, fine cotton in summer colors with lace trim and pearl buttons. Clara examined them carefully, noting the quality of the original construction. The wastes need to be taken in, Mrs. Winters said. I've lost weight since these were made. Can you do it without ruining the line? Yes, ma'am. It will take precise work, but it can be done. And your price? Clara named a fair rate. Not cheap, but not expensive for the skill required. Mrs. Winters' eyebrows rose. That seems rather high for simple alterations. The work isn't simple, Mrs. Winters. Taking in a waist while maintaining the drape and balance of a garment requires experience and precision. If you prefer to send them to Portland, No. Mrs. Winters waved a dismissive hand. I suppose your rate is acceptable. When can you have them ready? 1 week. 3 days. Clara met her eyes steadily. 1 week, Mrs. Winters. Quality work takes time. If you need them sooner, I can recommend rushing them to Portland on the next stage. For a moment, tension crackled in the small room. Then Mrs. Winters gave a tight smile. Very well. 1 week. But they must be perfect. They will be. After Mrs. Winters left, Maggie appeared in the doorway, her expression approving. You stood your ground. That's good. Patricia Winters tests everyone, seeing how far she can push. You pushed back. I know my worth, Clara said quietly, though her hands were trembling slightly. I won't undervalue my skills just to be liked. That'll make life harder here, Maggie warned, but you'll respect yourself more in the morning. Clara worked late into the night on Mrs. Winters' alterations, her oil lamp burning while the rest of the boarding house slept. The precision required was exactly what she'd promised. Each stitch had to be invisible. Each seam had to fall perfectly. Each adjustment had to preserve the original designer's intent while correcting for the changed measurements. It was painstaking, exacting work, and Clara found peace in it. This was something she could control. The fabric didn't care how tall she was. The thread didn't whisper behind her back. The needle simply went where she directed it, creating something beautiful and functional from her own skilled hands. On her 10th day in Pine Hollow, Clara ventured to the edge of town where the forest pressed close. She'd heard the logging crews worked nearby and wanted to see the operation that employed so many of Pine Hollow's men. The sound of axes and saws grew louder as she walked, and soon she could smell fresh-cut timber on the autumn air. The logging site was controlled chaos. Men worked in coordinated teams, some felling trees with massive two-man saws, others trimming branches and cutting logs to length. Horses stood in patient teams waiting to drag timber to the collection point. It was dangerous work. Clara could see that immediately. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and a man could be crushed or maimed. You shouldn't be here. She turned to find Jonah Calder approaching, his face stern. He wore the same work clothes as his crew, though she noticed his were slightly better maintained, the tiers patched with careful stitches. I was curious, Clara said. I've never seen logging before. It's not a spectacle for sightseeing. His tone was sharper than she'd heard before. This is a work site. It's dangerous for the men, and it's dangerous for you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interfere. Jonah's expression softened slightly. I know you didn't, but a moment's distraction can cost a man his fingers, or worse. The crews need to focus. He gestured back toward town. Come on, I'll walk you back. They moved away from the work site, and Clara heard the rhythm of axes resume behind them. Jonah walked with his hands in his pockets, his long strides eating ground quickly. How is your sewing work coming? He asked after a moment. Well enough. I have several commissions now. Mrs. Winters, the banker's wife, has asked me to alter some dresses. Patricia Winters. Jonah's mouth twitched. Did she try to negotiate you down to half your rate? She tried. And you held firm? I did. Good. He glanced at her. Patricia respects people who stand up to her. She'll tell her friends you're competent and fair, even if she won't admit it to your face. They walked in companionable silence for a while. The forest surrounded them, massive Douglas firs reaching toward a sky visible only in patches between the canopy. Clara had never experienced anything like this. The scale of it, the ancient quiet broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of work. How long have you been logging? She asked. Since I was 16, nearly 15 years now. Jonah's gaze moved over the trees with the familiarity of long knowledge. Started as a timber cruiser, scouting which trees to cut, marking the best routes. Worked my way up to foreman. Do you enjoy it? He considered the question seriously. It's honest work. You see the results of your labor at the end of each day. The forest provides, but you have to respect it, understand it. Cut too much or cut wrong, and you destroy the very thing that feeds you. He paused. So yes, I enjoy it. But more than that, I respect it. Clara found herself watching the way he moved through the forest, confident, careful, reading signs in the landscape that she couldn't even see. Agnes said your camp has the best safety record in the region. We do. There was quiet pride in his voice. I don't push the men past what's safe. Some bosses drive their crews hard, trying to maximize profit. But injured men can't work, and dead men can't feed their families. I'd rather cut less timber and bring everyone home whole. That must make you unpopular with the mill owners. Jonah shrugged. Edwin Hale would prefer I push harder, take more risks. But I contract independently, and my timber's quality is better than his other suppliers. He needs me more than I need him. The mention of Edwin's name brought a sourness to Clara's mouth. I haven't seen him since that first day. He keeps to his big house and his mill office. Jonah's tone was neutral, but Clara sensed disapproval underneath. Edwin likes to be important, likes people to know he's successful. Having a rejected bride in town, still walking around, still functioning, it bothers him more than it bothers you, I'd wager. You'd win that wager, Clara said. I'm too busy to waste time being bothered. Jonah looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something like approval in his gray eyes. You're tougher than you seem, Miss Whitmore. I've had to be, Mr. Calder. They'd reached the edge of town. Jonah stopped, touching his hat. I'd best get back to the crew, but Miss Whitmore, Clara, if I may? She nodded, surprised by the use of her first name. You're making a place for yourself here. That takes courage. Don't let anyone, not Edwin, not the gossips, not anyone, make you feel small for being exactly who you are. Before she could respond, he'd turned and headed back into the forest, disappearing among the trees with the ease of someone completely at home in the wilderness. Clara walked back to the boarding house with Jonah's words echoing in her mind. Don't let anyone make you feel small for being exactly who you are. It was such a simple concept, yet she'd spent most of her life trying to make herself smaller, slouching to hide her height, speaking softly to avoid drawing attention, apologizing for taking up space she had every right to occupy. What would it be like to stop apologizing, to stand at her full height without shame? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. That evening, as Clara sat in her room finishing Mrs. Winter's alterations by lamplight, Sarah Holbrook knocked on her door. I brought you something, Sarah said, holding out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Emma and I thought you might need it. Inside was a beautiful piece of deep burgundy wool, enough for a skirt or perhaps a jacket. Clara looked up in confusion. We can't accept this for free, Sarah said quickly. We're commissioning it as payment. Emma needs a winter coat and I'd like a new walking skirt, but we thought you should have something nice for yourself too. Something that shows Pine Hollow you're here to stay. Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. That's very kind. It's practical, Sarah corrected, but her smile was warm. You can't build a reputation wearing the same 3 dresses. And besides, you're our friend. Friends help each other. After Sarah left, Clara held the burgundy wool against her cheek, feeling its softness. Friends. She'd had colleagues in Boston, fellow seamstresses who shared lunch and complained about difficult customers. But friends? Real friends? That had been a luxury she couldn't afford when she was too busy being invisible. She worked the burgundy wool into her schedule, stealing hours late at night to create something for herself. A walking suit, jacket, and skirt, in a style that celebrated her height rather than trying to disguise it. Clean lines, perfect fit, a garment that announced capability and confidence. When Mrs. Winters came to collect her altered dresses exactly 1 week later, her expression was carefully neutral as she examined Clara's work. She held each dress up to the light, checked every seam, tested every button. This is acceptable, she finally said. Agnes Morton, who'd stopped by ostensibly to deliver thread but really to see how the alteration turned out, snorted. That's Patricia speak for excellent work. A flicker of amusement crossed Mrs. Winters' face. Perhaps. She paid Clara without argument, then paused at the door. I'll be having a small gathering next month. Several ladies from the surrounding area will attend. If you'd like, you could display some of your work. Perhaps take commissions. It was an olive branch extended with characteristic Patricia Winters stiffness, but an olive branch nonetheless. Clara recognized it for the valuable opportunity it was. "I would be honored, Mrs. Winters. Thank you." After she left, Agnes grinned. "You've arrived, girl. If Patricia's showing you off to her friends, you're going to have more work than you can handle." "I hope so," Clara said. But even as she spoke, she felt a twinge of anxiety. More work meant more stability, but it also meant more visibility, more chances for people to judge and reject her. As if reading her thoughts, Agnes said, "Stop that." "Stop what?" "Whatever you're thinking that's making you look like you've swallowed something sour, you're good at what you do. Own it." The logging crews came to town on a Saturday, exactly 2 weeks after Jonah had promised. Clara heard them before she saw them. Rough voices, laughter, the sound of horses and wagons rolling down Main Street. She watched from her window as more than 30 men descended on Pine Hollow, heading straight for the saloon and general store. Within an hour, there was a knock on her door. Jonah Calder stood in the hallway, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were 3 men in various states of clothing distress, torn shirts, pants with split seams, jackets missing buttons. "Miss Whitmore," Jonah said formally. "These are some of my crew. They were hoping you might help with repairs." The men shuffled their feet, looking anywhere but directly at her. She understood immediately. Jonah had volunteered them, probably told them to be respectful, and now they were uncertain how to behave around a woman as tall as most of them. "Of course," Clara said. "Come in. Let me see what needs fixing." For the next 3 hours, she worked steadily while men cycled through her room in sheepish groups. Some needed simple repairs, buttons reattached, seams reinforced. Others needed more extensive work. She measured, pinned, made notes, quoted fair prices that made them blink but ultimately nod in agreement. Jonah stayed the entire time, leaning against the door frame and watching. His presence seemed to put the men at ease, though Clara wasn't sure if he was there to chaperone them or her. When the last logger left, promising to return in 2 days for his repaired jacket, Jonah straightened. "Thank you for taking them on," he said. "I know it was short notice." "It's good work," Claire replied, organizing her notes. "Steady work. I appreciate you sending them." "They appreciate having someone who can actually sew a straight seam." Jonah hesitated, then added, "We're having a supply run to the upper camp next week. Some of the men live up there year-round, only come to town every few months. They could use someone to look at their clothes, maybe take measurements for new gear. Would you be willing to make the trip?" Clara looked up sharply. "To the logging camp?" "It's a half-day's ride each way. You'd stay overnight. We have a cook cabin that's separate and secure. I'd make sure you had privacy and protection." He met her eyes steadily. "But I understand if you'd rather not. It's rough country, and the camp's no place for a woman?" Clara finished. "I was going to say for someone unused to frontier conditions. But yes, also for a woman alone among 30 loggers." He didn't seem embarrassed by the admission. "It would be profitable for you, though. The men have money and few places to spend it, and the ride's beautiful, if you can appreciate wilderness." Clara thought about it. The practical part of her brain calculated the potential income. 30 men, each needing repairs or new garments. The cautious part reminded her she barely knew these people, was putting herself in a vulnerable position. But there was another part, a newer part, that had been growing since she stood in that town square and refused Edwin Hale's money, that wanted to say yes simply because it was the bolder choice. "I'll need to bring my sewing kit and measurement tools," she said, "and fabric samples in case anyone wants custom work." Jonah's face broke into a rare smile. "I'll make sure there's space in the wagon. We leave Tuesday morning, first light." After he left, Clara sat by her window and wondered what she'd just agreed to. A journey into the wilderness with a man she barely knew, to spend time with rough loggers in conditions she couldn't imagine. It was foolish, possibly dangerous, certainly improper by Boston standards. But Boston was 2,000 miles away, and she wasn't the same woman who'd left it. Sunday passed quietly. Clara attended church with the Holbrook sisters, enduring curious stares and whispered comments. The sermon was about accepting divine will and finding one's place in the order of things. and Clara couldn't help but feel the minister's eyes settling on her during certain passages about pride and humility. Monday, she worked frantically to finish outstanding repairs and prepare for the trip. Agnes helped her select fabric samples that would withstand the journey, and Maggie packed food that would travel well. "You're sure about this?" Maggie asked, tucking dried apples and hard cheese into a canvas bag. "Going up to the camp alone?" "Jonah Calder will be there, and he seems honorable." "He is honorable," Maggie agreed. "One of the best men in Pine Hollow, if you ask me. But that doesn't change the fact that you'll be the only woman among 30 men who haven't seen female company in months." "I've handled difficult men before," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. Maggie studied her for a long moment. "You have, haven't you? Well, just remember, if any of them step out of line, you come straight back and report it to Sheriff Morrison. And to me, I'll box their ears myself if needed." Clara hugged her impulsively. "Thank you for looking out for me." "Someone has to," Maggie said gruffly, but she was smiling. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear. Clara woke before dawn and dressed in her most practical clothes, a sturdy skirt, wool blouse, and the jacket she'd made from her own fabric. She braided her hair tightly and packed her sewing kit with methodical care. Jonah was waiting outside the boarding house with a sturdy wagon and 2 draft horses. His expression was serious in the pale morning light. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, as he helped her up to the wagon seat. Clara settled her skirts and met his eyes. "I don't change my mind once it's made, Mr. Calder." "Jonah," he corrected. "If we're going to spend a day traveling together, we might as well use Christian names." "Then you should call me Clara." They pulled out of Pine Hollow as the town was waking, heading north into country that grew wilder with each passing mile. The road, barely more than a track in places, wound through dense forest. Ancient trees towered overhead, their branches filtering the morning sunlight into cathedral-like shafts of gold. Jonah drove with relaxed competence, the reins easy in his scarred hands. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, a creek where fish ran thick in spring, a meadow where elk gathered, the charred remains of a forest fire from 3 years past. "How did you end up in Oregon?" Clara asked. "Followed the work," Jonah said. "Started in Michigan, but the forests there were already getting cut over. Heard there was virgin timber out west, so I came. That was back in '76. "Do you have family?" "Not anymore." His voice was matter-of-fact without self-pity. "Parents died of fever when I was young, grew up in a boys' home in Detroit, left as soon as I could." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me self-reliance. And it taught me that family's what you make, not just what you're born to." He glanced at her. "What about you? You mentioned Boston, but not much else." Clara found herself telling him things she rarely shared, about her parents' death when she was 19, about her sister's marriage to a man who resented having to shelter Clara, about 10 years of making herself small and useful and invisible. "That's why you came west," Jonah said when she finished. "You were tired of being invisible." "Yes," Clara said, surprised by his understanding. "Though I seem to have overcorrected. I'm rather visible now." "In all the right ways?" Jonah's tone was casual, but Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You're making yourself impossible to ignore through competence and determination. That's different than being stared at for your height. One's about what you do. The other's just people being small-minded." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the lunch Maggie had packed. Jonah built a small fire and made coffee in a battered pot, the familiar ritual oddly comforting in the wilderness. Clara stretched her legs, walking along the creek bank while he tended the horses. The forest was nothing like the managed parks of Boston. This was wild, untouched, immense in a way that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and more alive than she'd felt in years. The creek rushed past, clear and cold, and somewhere nearby a bird called with a sound she'd never heard before. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jonah said, coming to stand beside her. "Overwhelming," Clara admitted. "I never knew places like this existed." "Most people don't. They stick to cities and towns, never see what's beyond the edges." He picked up a smooth river stone and sent it skipping across a quiet pool. "But it's out here where you really find out who you are. The wilderness doesn't care about your reputation or your manners or what church you attend. It just cares whether you can survive it." Clara thought about that as they resumed their journey. In Boston, She'd survived by making herself acceptable, by fitting into spaces that weren't designed for someone like her. Out here, survival seemed to be about something different, about capability and strength and the courage to face challenges directly. They reached the logging camp in late afternoon. It was larger than Clara had expected, a collection of rough buildings clustered around a central clearing, bunkhouses for the men, a cookhouse that sent smoke into the evening air, storage sheds for tools and equipment, and a small office cabin where Jonah clearly lived. Men stopped working to stare as the wagon rolled in. Clara kept her spine straight and her expression calm, refusing to show the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Jonah pulled up in front of the cookhouse and jumped down. "Listen up," he called, his voice carrying across the camp. "This is Miss Clara Whitmore. She's a seamstress from Pine Hollow, and she's here to help with clothing repairs and take measurements for new gear. You'll treat her with respect and courtesy, or you'll answer to me, understood?" A chorus of "Yes, boss" came from the assembled men. "Good, she'll be in the cookhouse starting after supper. You'll come in small groups, keep your language clean, and conduct yourselves like gentlemen." Jonah's gray eyes swept the crew. "Any man who makes her uncomfortable will be on the next wagon back to town without his pay. Clear?" "Clear, boss." Jonah helped Clara down from the wagon, his hand steady and impersonal. "The cook cabin's just there," he said quietly, pointing to a small building set slightly apart. "It's clean and secure. You'll have privacy." The cook turned out to be a grizzled man named Pete, who ran his domain with military precision. He showed Clara to a small room off the main kitchen, barely more than a closet, but scrupulously clean with a narrow bed and a chair. "Nobody comes in my kitchen without permission," Pete said firmly. "You need anything, you call out. I'm here most hours and Mr. Calder's cabin is just across the clearing. You'll be safe enough." Supper was a boisterous affair with 30 hungry men crowding around long tables, shoveling down beans and cornbread and roasted venison with single-minded intensity. Clara ate in the corner, trying not to draw attention, but she felt every glance, every whispered comment. After the meal, the men lined up nervously outside the cookhouse door. Jonah had organized them into groups of 3, and they came in at intervals, clutching damaged clothing and looking everywhere but directly at Clara. She worked efficiently, making repairs when possible, taking measurements when necessary, discussing fabric weights and prices with men who were surprisingly knowledgeable about what would hold up to hard use. They were respectful, almost painfully polite, and she realized that Jonah's reputation for fairness had earned him loyalty from men who would protect anything, or anyone, he valued. Near midnight, the last group finished. Clara's fingers ached and her eyes burned with tiredness, but she'd taken more than 40 orders and made immediate repairs worth 3 weeks of normal work. Jonah appeared as she was packing up her supplies. "How did it go?" "Very well, better than I expected." "The men appreciate having someone skilled to help." He paused. "Thank you for coming all this way. I know it wasn't easy." "It was worth it," Clara said honestly, "though I confess I'll be glad to sleep in a real bed tomorrow night." Jonah smiled. "Pete's beds aren't that bad. But yes, I expect Maggie's boarding house will feel luxurious after a night up here." He moved toward the door, then turned back. "Clara, you handled yourself well today. The men respect that. You made them feel like customers, not charity cases. That matters to them." After he left, Clara lay in the narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest night. She felt exhausted, but also energized, like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. She'd come to Pine Hollow expecting to disappear into marriage, to trade her independence for security. Instead, she'd found work that challenged her, a community that was slowly accepting her, and something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name, but felt growing stronger each day. Tomorrow she would return to town. She would sew the garment she'd promised, deliver the repairs, build her reputation one careful stitch at a time. She would stand tall in Pine Hollow, not because anyone gave her permission, but because she'd claimed that right for herself. And somehow, without quite knowing when it had happened, that had stopped feeling like defiance and started feeling like home. The wagon jolted over a rough patch of road on the return journey, and Clara braced herself against the seat. Dawn had barely broken when they'd left the camp, the forest still wrapped in mist that clung to the trees like whispered secrets. Jonah had been quiet since they departed, his attention focused on navigating the treacherous path down from the high country. "Storm's coming," he said finally, nodding toward dark clouds gathering over the western peaks. We should reach Pine Hollow before it hits, but it'll be close. Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the rising wind. How can you tell? The way the air feels, pressure changes, animals acting different. He glanced at her. You learn to read weather when your life depends on it. Miss a storm warning up in the high camps. Men can die. They made good time despite the deteriorating weather, but the first raindrops began falling an hour outside Pine Hollow. Within minutes, it became a downpour that turned the road to mud and reduced visibility to a few yards. Jonah pulled the horses to a halt near a rocky overhang that provided minimal shelter. We'll wait it out, he said, helping Clara down from the exposed wagon seat. They huddled under the overhang while rain hammered the earth around them, the horses standing patient and miserable in their traces. Clara was soaked through despite the brief exposure, her carefully pinned hair coming loose in wet strands. She tried to gather it back, but her cold fingers fumbled with the pins. Here. Jonah pulled a relatively dry bandana from inside his coat. It's clean enough. She took it gratefully, using it to tie her hair back. They sat side by side on a fallen log, watching the storm rage. Does this happen often? Clara asked, trying to keep her teeth from chattering. This time of year, yes. Autumn storms can be fierce. Jonah shrugged out of his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders before she could protest. I'm used to cold. You're not. The coat held his warmth and smelled of wood smoke and pine. Clara pulled it closer, feeling oddly vulnerable in the gesture's intimacy. Tell me about the camp, she said, partly to distract herself from the cold, partly because she was genuinely curious. How do you manage so many men in such rough conditions? Jonah was quiet for a moment, watching the rain. You treat them fair, pay them honest wages. Keep them safe as you can. Don't ask them to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. He paused. Most logging bosses see their crews as tools, use them hard, replace them when they break. I see them as men with families depending on them. Makes all the difference. Is that why they're so loyal to you? Loyalty has to be earned. I've worked alongside every man in that camp, bled with them, buried friends with them. They know I won't sacrifice their safety for profit. His voice held quiet conviction. Edwin Hale thinks I'm soft. Says I could cut twice the timber if I pushed harder. But I can sleep at night knowing I brought my men home alive. Clara studied his profile in the gray stormlight. You and Edwin don't get along. We tolerate each other because we have to. I supply his mill with quality timber. He pays me fair market rates, but we'll never be friends. Jonah's jaw tightened. Edwin measures success by how much he owns, how important people think he is. I measure it by whether I can look myself in the mirror each morning. He wanted a wife who would make him look important, Clara said softly. Someone petite and decorative, a possession to display. Then he's a fool. Jonah turned to look at her directly. A woman like you, capable, strong, unafraid to stand her ground, that's worth more than any decoration. Heat flooded Clara's face that had nothing to do with the cold. Before she could respond, the rain began to ease, thinning from downpour to steady drizzle. We should move, Jonah said, standing and offering his hand. Road will be worse now, but we can make it if we're careful. The journey back took twice as long as it should have, the wagon sliding in mud and the horses struggling for purchase on the slick road. By the time they reached Pine Hollow, both Clara and Jonah were exhausted and thoroughly soaked despite their best efforts. Maggie came running from the boarding house the moment the wagon stopped, her face tight with worry. Thank heavens! When the storm hit, I thought you might be caught in the high country. She took in Clara's bedraggled state. Come inside immediately. You need dry clothes and hot food. Jonah helped Clara down, his hand steady on her waist. I'll bring your supplies around tomorrow, once they've had a chance to dry. Thank you, Clara said, for everything. His gray eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. My pleasure, Clara. She watched him drive the wagon toward the livery, then let Maggie bustle her inside. Sarah and Emma had hot water ready, and within an hour Clara was clean, dry, and wrapped in a borrowed robe while her clothes dried by the fire. Tell us everything, Sarah demanded, settling on Clara's bed with Emma. Was the camp terrifying? Were the men awful? Did anything exciting happen? Clara found herself laughing as she recounted the journey, editing out certain moments like the storm shelter and Jonah's coat, The way his words had made her feel seen and valued in a way she'd never experienced before. The next weeks passed in a blur of work. Clara's success at the logging camp brought a flood of new customers. Women who'd been hesitant suddenly wanted their wardrobes refreshed, their daughters' dresses altered, their husbands' work clothes properly fitted. She hired Sarah to help with basic sewing, teaching her techniques while managing the growing volume of orders. Money began to accumulate in the tin box Clara kept hidden under her floorboard. Not a fortune, but enough to feel secure, enough to prove she could survive on her own skills. October gave way to November, and Patricia Winter's gathering approached. Clara worked late into the nights creating display pieces, a wool traveling suit, a delicate blouse with intricate pin-tucking, men's work clothes that showed her range. She also finished her own burgundy walking suit, the one Sarah and Emma had commissioned as payment for their friendship. The night before the gathering, Clara tried on the completed suit and stood before her small mirror. The deep burgundy made her skin glow, and the tailoring emphasized her height rather than trying to hide it. For the first time in her life, she looked at her reflection and saw not a problem to be solved, but a woman of striking presence. "You look beautiful," Emma said from the doorway. She'd knocked, but Clara had been too absorbed to hear. "Really, Clara, you look like you belong in a fashion magazine." "I look too tall," Clara said automatically, old habits dying hard. "You look exactly as tall as you should be," Emma corrected, "and that suit is a masterpiece. Every woman at Patricia's gathering is going to want one." The gathering was held at the Winters house, the largest residence in Pine Hollow. A grand Victorian structure that proclaimed Edwin Hale's mill brought prosperity to the region. Clara arrived with her display pieces carefully packed, her stomach churning with nervousness. Patricia greeted her with cool efficiency. "Miss Whitmore, you may set up in the parlor. The ladies will be arriving shortly." The parlor was elegantly appointed with velvet furniture and imported carpets. Clara arranged her samples with careful precision, making sure each piece showed to best advantage. Then she stood by the window and waited, watching carriages arrive and women in expensive dresses sweep into the house. They came in chattering groups, wives of mill owners and merchants and successful ranchers from the surrounding territory. Most were older than Clara, married women of status and means. They examined her work with critical eyes, touching fabric, checking seams, whispering among themselves. "This stitching is exquisite," one woman said, examining the blouse. "I haven't seen work this fine outside of San Francisco." "The cut is unusual," another observed. "Modern, I like it." Clara answered questions, quoted prices, took preliminary measurements. Some women were genuinely interested. Others seemed to be there primarily to stare at the woman Edwin Hale had rejected, their curiosity barely masked by polite conversation. "So you're the mail-order bride," one matron said loudly enough to turn heads. "How brave of you to stay after such public embarrassment." Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward her. This was the moment she could crumble, could stammer apologies and retreat. But she'd spent 2 months building a life in Pine Hollow, had stood tall in logging camps, and learned to value her own worth. "I prefer to think of it as practical, Mrs. Harrison," she said calmly. "I have skills Pine Hollow needs, and the town has opportunities Boston couldn't offer. Mr. Hale's rejection simply freed me to build something on my own terms rather than his." The room went silent. Then Patricia Winters laughed, a genuine sound of surprised approval. "Well said, Miss Whitmore, well said indeed." She turned to Mrs. Harrison. "I think we could all learn something about turning setbacks into opportunities. Don't you agree, Constance?" Mrs. Harrison's face reddened, but she managed a tight smile. The tension broke, and the gathering resumed its normal flow. By the end of the afternoon, Clara had taken deposits for 7 major commissions and handed out cards listing her rates and location. As the party wound down, Patricia pulled Clara aside. "You handled Constance beautifully. She's been trying to put me in my place for years. Nice to see someone else stand up to her." She paused. "You're good for Pine Hollow, Miss Whitmore. We need more women with backbone and fewer who just simper and agree with their husbands." Walking home that evening, Clara felt lighter than she had in months. The gathering had been a success professionally, but more than that, it had proven she could hold her own among Pine Hollow's social elite without compromising herself. Jonah appeared from the direction of the livery as she passed, his face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "How did it go?" Better than I hoped. Clara couldn't keep the pride from her voice. 7 new commissions, and Patricia Winters actually complimented me. That's like getting blessed by the Queen of England, Jonah said, grinning. You're officially a success. They walked together toward the boarding house, falling into the easy rhythm that had developed between them. Clara had grown accustomed to these encounters, finding Jonah at unexpected moments, falling into conversation as naturally as breathing. The camp's closing for winter next week, he said. We'll move the men down to the low country operation. I'll be in town more often through the cold months. Clara's heart gave an unexpected leap. That's good. For business, I mean. The men will need winter clothes repaired. Oh, of course, Jonah agreed, but something in his tone suggested he understood she meant more than business. Clara, I was wondering if you might… Well, if it isn't my former intended… Edwin Hale's voice cut through the evening air like a knife. He stood outside the saloon, clearly several drinks into his evening, flanked by Tom Russell and 2 other mill workers. His face was flushed, his expression ugly. Good evening, Mr. Hale, Clara said coolly, moving to walk past. Edwin stepped into her path. I hear you've been making quite a name for yourself. Playing seamstress, going up to the logging camps. He sneered. Tell me, does Calder pay you for sewing, or are there other services you provide? The implication was clear and vile. Clara felt fury rise hot in her chest, but before she could respond, Jonah stepped forward. Watch your mouth, Hale. His voice was deadly quiet. Or what? Edwin laughed, emboldened by whiskey and his audience. You'll defend your woman's honor? Everyone knows what's really going on. The rejected bride finding comfort with the logger. It's pathetic. Edwin? Jonah's hands were clenched at his sides, and Clara could see him fighting for control. You're drunk and you're being a fool. Apologize to Miss Whitmore and go home. I don't apologize to women who… Mr. Hale, Clara's voice rang clear and strong, cutting through his words. You rejected me because I didn't meet your expectations of what a wife should look like. That was your choice, and you're entitled to it. But you don't get to slander me because I chose to stay and build a life without you. You're nothing without a husband, Edwin spat. Nothing but a freakishly tall spinster playing at being independent. I'm a businesswoman earning an honest living through skilled work, Clara said, her voice steady despite the rage shaking her limbs. That makes me considerably more than a sad man who measures his worth by how much smaller his wife is than him. Tom Russell laughed at that, a sharp bark of genuine amusement that he quickly tried to suppress. Edwin's face went purple. You think you're so clever, he hissed, but you're still just a rejected woman pretending to be something you're not. This town will never truly accept you. That's where you're wrong. The new voice belonged to Agnes Morton, who'd emerged from her store with Maggie Brennan beside her. Other townsfolk had gathered too, drawn by the raised voices. Clara's earned her place in Pine Hollow through skill and hard work. That's more than some people can say, Edwin. She's made herself invaluable to this community, Patricia Winters added, stepping out of the shadows with her husband. And she's conducted herself with more dignity in 2 months than you've shown in 2 years. Edwin looked around at the assembled crowd, clearly surprised to find public opinion turned against him. This is ridiculous. She's nothing. She's a respected member of this town, Sheriff Morrison said, appearing with the quiet authority that had kept Pine Hollow peaceful for a decade. And you're drunk and disorderly, Edwin. I suggest you go home and sleep it off before you say something you'll regret even more. For a moment, Edwin seemed ready to argue. Then he caught sight of the faces around him, townspeople who'd witnessed his cruelty and found it wanting. His bravado crumbled, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. This isn't over, he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. He turned and stumbled away, Tom Russell and the other men following with considerably less enthusiasm than they'd shown earlier. The crowd dispersed slowly, people offering Clara words of support as they passed. Patricia Winters paused longest. I meant what I said earlier. You're good for this town. She glanced at Jonah, still standing protectively beside Clara. Both of you are. Then she swept away, leaving them alone in the darkening street. Clara felt the adrenaline draining from her body, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Thank you, she said to Jonah, for standing with me. You didn't need me, Jonah said quietly. You handled him perfectly, but I couldn't stand by and let him talk to you that way. They stood in the growing darkness, the space between them charged with unspoken things. Finally, Jonah said, "What I was trying to ask before Edwin interrupted. Would you have dinner with me? Not at the boarding house or anywhere public. I'd like to cook for you at my cabin. Just the two of us." Clara's breath caught. It was an invitation that crossed the line from friendship into something more intentional, more dangerous. She should refuse, should maintain propriety, should protect the reputation she'd worked so hard to build. "Yes," she heard herself say. "I'd like that." Jonah's smile was like sunrise. "Saturday evening? I'll come collect you at 6. The next days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara worked through her commissions with mechanical efficiency, her mind constantly drifting to Saturday. She told herself it was just dinner, just two friends sharing a meal. But she knew it was more than that, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. Sarah noticed her distraction immediately. "What's got you so preoccupied?" Clara hesitated, then admitted, "Jonah Calder invited me to dinner at his cabin." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Clara, that's wonderful. He's been watching you for weeks with this look on his face, like a man who's found something he didn't know he was searching for." "It's just dinner," Clara protested weakly. "It's never just dinner," Emma said from the doorway, grinning. "Not when a man like Jonah Calder invites a woman to his private cabin. He could have asked you to any restaurant in town, but he wants you alone. That means something. What if I'm reading too much into it?" Clara's old insecurities surfaced. "What if he just wants to discuss business arrangements, or—" "Clara." Sarah took her hands. "Stop. Jonah Calder doesn't invite women to dinner for business discussions. He invites you because he admires you, respects you, and, I'd wager, is more than a little bit in love with you." "Love?" Clara's voice came out strangled. "That's absurd. We barely know each other." "You've spent weeks together," Emma pointed out. "Traveled to the camp, worked side by side, talked for hours. Just because it didn't follow traditional courtship rules doesn't mean it's not real." Saturday arrived wrapped in cold autumn sunshine. Clara dressed with agonizing care in her burgundy suit, arranging her hair 3 different ways before settling on a simple style that made her look sophisticated rather than trying too hard. Jonah arrived precisely at 6, wearing clean clothes and looking scrubbed and nervous in a way that made Clara's heart twist. He handed her a bouquet of late autumn wildflowers. "I know they're not much," he said, "but I thought—" "They're perfect," Clara interrupted, burying her face in the blooms to hide her smile. His cabin sat at the edge of town where forest met settlement, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and glass windows that caught the evening light. Inside was surprisingly comfortable. A main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, a loft bedroom visible through an open ladder. Books lined one wall and everything was scrupulously clean. "I wasn't sure what you'd like," Jonah said, suddenly awkward. "So I made venison stew. It's not fancy, but it smells wonderful," Clara said honestly. The rich aroma of meat and vegetables filled the cabin, and she realized she was genuinely hungry. They ate at a small table by the window, talking about everything and nothing. Books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored and abandoned and sometimes revived. Jonah was surprisingly well read, with opinions on literature that showed careful thought. Clara found herself laughing more freely than she had in years. After dinner, they sat by the fire with cups of coffee, the conversation deepening. "Why did you really come west?" Jonah asked. "The real reason, not the one you tell people." Clara stared into the flames. "Because I was tired of being ashamed of myself, tired of apologizing for existing. Edwin's letters promised a place where strength and capability mattered more than fitting into narrow expectations. I thought if I could just get far enough away from Boston, from everyone who'd ever made me feel wrong, I could finally be myself." She laughed bitterly. "Then Edwin took one look at me and proved that narrow expectations exist everywhere." "But you stayed anyway." "I stayed because leaving felt like admitting they were right, that I am too much, too different, that I should hide and apologize and make myself small." Clara met his eyes. "I stayed because I was angry enough to refuse to disappear." Jonah nodded slowly. "I understand that anger. I grew up in that boys' home being told I was nothing, that I'd never amount to anything. Every tree I fell, every camp I run successfully, every man I bring home safe, it's all proof that they were wrong about me." He paused. "But it gets lonely, building a life just to prove people wrong." "Yes," Clara whispered. "It does." "What if we built something different?" Jonah's voice was careful, tentative. "Not to prove anything to anyone, but just because we wanted to?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you asking, Jonah?" He stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "I'm asking if you'd consider letting this become something more than friendship. I'm asking if you feel what I feel when we're together, like all the pieces that never quite fit anywhere else suddenly make sense." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "I feel it, but Jonah, I can't. I won't be someone's project to fix or someone's good deed. I won't be with you because you pity me." "Pity?" Jonah's laugh was incredulous. "Clara, I'm in awe of you. Your courage, your refusal to bend, the way you stand tall no matter who's watching. You walked into that town square and claimed your dignity back from a man who tried to shame you. You built a business from nothing. You faced down gossip and cruelty with your head high." His grip tightened on her hands. "I don't pity you. I admire you more than anyone I've ever known." "I'm terrified," Clara admitted. "Terrified of trusting this, of believing it's real. What if it doesn't work?" Jonah finished. "Then we'll have tried and failed, which is better than wondering what might have been." His gray eyes were steady, honest. "I can't promise perfect, Clara. I'm gone for weeks at a time during logging season. I'm rough around the edges and better with trees than social graces, but I can promise honesty, respect, and partnership. I can promise that I'll never ask you to be anything other than exactly who you are." Clara looked at their joined hands, hers long and skilled with a needle, his scarred from years of hard labor. Two people who'd never quite fit anywhere, who'd built lives from determination and refusing to accept others' limitations. "I'd like to try," she said softly, "but slowly. I need time to trust this." "We've got time," Jonah assured her. "All the time you need." He helped her to her feet, and they stood together by the fire. Jonah was one of the few men Clara had ever met who made her feel delicate by comparison. His height, his breadth of shoulder, the quiet strength in his hands as they held hers. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. Clara nodded, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle, careful, a question rather than a demand. Clara felt something unlock in her chest, years of loneliness, of believing she'd never be chosen, of thinking she was too much for anyone to love. When they finally pulled apart, Jonah rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you home, before Maggie sends out a search party." The walk back to the boarding house felt like moving through a dream. Jonah's hand was warm around hers, and Clara couldn't stop smiling despite the cold wind cutting through her coat. At the boarding house steps, he kissed her once more, sweet and brief. "Can I see you tomorrow? Maybe we could take a walk, if the weather holds." "I'd like that," Clara said. She watched him walk away, then turned to find Maggie standing in the doorway with a knowing smile. "Don't say a word," Clara warned, but she was grinning. "Wouldn't dream of it," Maggie said, "though I will say it's about time. That man's been looking at you like you hung the moon since the day you arrived." Clara floated up to her room, her mind replaying every moment of the evening. She'd come to Pine Hollow expecting to trade her independence for security through marriage. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable: partnership with someone who saw her strength rather than her strangeness, who valued her capabilities rather than trying to diminish them. It was terrifying and exhilarating and more real than anything she'd ever experienced. And somewhere in Edwin Hale's grand house, a small, bitter man nursed his whiskey and his wounded pride, completely unaware that his rejection had set in motion exactly what Clara needed: the freedom to choose her own path and the courage to claim a future built on her own terms. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. The kind of November day that promised winter was gathering its strength just beyond the mountains. Clara woke with Jonah's kiss still warm on her lips, a feeling of possibility humming through her veins that made even the mundane task of dressing feel significant. She was pinning her hair when Sarah knocked, bursting in without waiting for an answer. "You have to tell me everything. Emma and I stayed up half the night speculating, and she's convinced you're going to announce an engagement by Christmas. It was one dinner, Clara protested, but she couldn't keep the smile from her face. One dinner that lasted until nearly 10 o'clock, Sarah pointed out. Maggie said you came back looking like you'd discovered something wonderful. Clara sat on the bed, gesturing for Sarah to join her. It was wonderful. Terrifying, but wonderful. He asked if we could build something together, not to prove anything to anyone, but just because we wanted to. And you said yes? I said I'd like to try, slowly. Clara twisted her hands in her lap. Sarah, I've never done this before. The courtship, the vulnerability, trusting someone to see all of me and not flinch away. What if I'm terrible at it? Sarah took her hands firmly. You won't be. You're one of the bravest people I know, Clara. You faced down Edwin Hale in front of the whole town. You built a business from nothing. You can certainly manage falling in love. I'm not falling in love, Clara said automatically, then stopped. Am I? Only you can answer that, Sarah said gently. But I will say this. Jonah Calder looks at you like you're the answer to a question he's been asking his whole life. And you look at him the same way. Before Clara could respond, Maggie's voice called up the stairs. Clara, you have a visitor! Clara's heart leaped, expecting Jonah. But when she descended to the parlor, she found Patricia Winters waiting, her expression grave. Miss Whitmore, I apologize for the early call, but there's a matter that requires immediate attention. Patricia's hands clutched her reticule tightly. Edwin Hale came to see my husband last night, after the incident on Main Street. He's planning something vindictive, and I thought you should be warned. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. What kind of something? He's petitioning the town council to revoke business licenses for what he's calling itinerant merchants without proper credentials. It's obviously aimed at you, though he's clever enough to word it broadly. Patricia's mouth thinned with disapproval. My husband sits on the council, and while he thinks Edwin's behavior is childish, some of the other members might support the measure simply because Edwin owns the mill. Can he actually do that? Force me to close my business? Not easily, but he can make things very difficult. The council meeting is Wednesday evening. You'll need to attend and speak in your own defense. Patricia stood. I wanted you to have time to prepare. Edwin's going to argue that you're taking business away from established merchants, by which he means Agnes Morton's ready-made goods, though Agnes herself thinks his petition is nonsense. After Patricia left, Clara stood in the parlor, feeling the walls close in. She'd been a fool to think Edwin would simply accept his public humiliation. Men like him didn't forgive perceived slights, especially not from women they considered beneath them. Don't look like that, Maggie said from the doorway. You're not beaten yet. I don't know how to fight this. What if the council sides with him? Then you fight harder. Maggie's voice was firm. You gather every customer who values your work, every person who's seen you contribute to this town, and you make them speak for you. You show that council that you're not some fly-by-night merchant, but a valuable member of Pine Hollow. Clara spent the rest of Sunday drafting a statement for the council meeting, her mind racing through arguments and counter-arguments. By evening, she had pages of notes, but no real confidence that words would be enough against Edwin's influence. Jonah appeared just as darkness fell, as promised for their walk. One look at Clara's face and he frowned. What's wrong? She told him about Edwin's petition, watching anger darken his features with each word. That petty, vindictive, Jonah caught himself, visibly fighting for control. He can't do this. You've built a legitimate business. He can try, and he has enough influence that he might succeed. Clara's voice was flat with exhaustion. Patricia warned me because her husband won't automatically oppose Edwin, even though he thinks the petition is foolish. If enough council members side with Edwin, then we make sure they don't. Jonah took her hands. Clara, listen to me. Edwin's powerful, but he's not well loved. He treats his workers poorly, drives hard bargains, looks down on anyone he considers beneath him. The town tolerates him because he brings jobs, not because they respect him. His gray eyes were fierce. You, on the other hand, have earned genuine respect. People like you. They value what you do. We use that. How? We organize. Tomorrow we visit every customer you've served, every person who's benefited from your work. We ask them to attend the council meeting and speak on your behalf. We show the council that you're not just some outsider trying to make a quick profit, but someone who's become part of Pine Hollow's fabric. Clara felt hope stirring despite her fear. You think it will work? I think it's worth fighting for. Jonah pulled her close, and she leaned into his warmth. You didn't come all this way and build all this just to let Edwin Hale tear it down out of spite. They spent Monday visiting Clara's customers, explaining the situation and asking for support. The responses varied. Some, like Agnes Morton and the Holbrook sisters, immediately promised to attend and speak. Others, intimidated by Edwin's power, made vague excuses about being busy Wednesday evening. Mrs. Winters surprised Clara by not only agreeing to speak, but offering to host a gathering of prominent women Tuesday afternoon to coordinate their statements. Edwin's forgotten that half the town council members have wives who value your services, Patricia said with grim satisfaction. We'll remind them. By Tuesday evening, Clara had commitments from 15 people to speak at the meeting. It wasn't everyone she'd hoped for, but it was enough to show the council that she had genuine community support. The gathering at the Winters house that afternoon proved illuminating. 12 women assembled in Patricia's elegant parlor, ranging from mill workers' wives to the school teachers to merchants' daughters. They represented different social strata, but they shared one thing: appreciation for Clara's skills and anger at Edwin's vindictiveness. This isn't really about business licenses, Agnes said bluntly. This is about a man who can't stand being publicly rejected. He thought Clara would slink back to Boston with her tail between her legs, and instead she thrived. His pride can't tolerate it. Then we need to make it about business, Patricia countered. The council won't care about Edwin's wounded feelings, but they will care about economic impact. Clara, how much money have you brought into Pine Hollow's economy? Clara had prepared for this question. In 3 months, I've earned approximately $300 through services and commissions. Most of that money was spent locally, on fabric from Agnes's store, on room and board at Maggie's, on supplies and food throughout town. I've also prevented money from leaving Pine Hollow by providing services locally that would otherwise require expensive orders from Portland or San Francisco. The women nodded approvingly. Margaret Chen, whose husband owned the general store, spoke up. My husband says local spending creates a multiplier effect. Every dollar Clara earns and spends here generates additional economic activity. Edwin should understand that. He's supposed to be a businessman. Edwin understands personal grudges better than sound economics, Agnes said dryly. They crafted a strategy for the meeting. Different women would speak to different aspects of Clara's value to the community. Economic impact, social contribution, the specific skills she provided that were otherwise unavailable locally. By the time the gathering dispersed, Clara felt armored in their support. Wednesday arrived too quickly. The council meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the town hall, a drafty building that served multiple purposes. Clara dressed carefully in her burgundy suit, wanting to look professional and capable without appearing to put on airs. Jonah met her at the boarding house, offering his arm. You ready? No, but I'm going anyway. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Word had spread about the petition, and it seemed half of Pine Hollow wanted to witness the confrontation. Edwin sat in the front row with Tom Russell and several other mill workers, his face set in lines of smug confidence. The council consisted of 7 men, Patricia's husband Charles Winters, the sheriff, 2 merchants, a rancher, the mill supervisor who worked under Edwin, and the land office clerk. They sat behind a long table at the front of the room, looking uncomfortable with the size of the crowd. Charles Winters called the meeting to order and dispensed with routine business quickly. Then he cleared his throat. We have a petition from Mr. Edwin Hale regarding merchant licensing requirements. Mr. Hale, you may present your case. Edwin stood, every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit. Gentlemen, thank you for hearing this important matter. Pine Hollow has always been a town that values proper order and established business practices. Recently, we've seen an influx of itinerant merchants, people without permanent ties to our community, who undercut established businesses and then disappear with their profits. Clara's hands clenched in her lap. He was being careful not to name her specifically, making it seem like a general policy concern rather than personal vendetta. I propose we require all merchants operating within town limits to obtain a business license, renewable annually, with fees sufficient to ensure only serious, committed business people remain, Edwin continued. This protects both our established merchants and our citizens from fly-by-night operations. What about existing merchants? Sheriff Morrison asked. Would they need to obtain these licenses retroactively? Only those who've established themselves within the past 6 months, Edwin said smoothly. Established businesses would be grandfathered in, naturally. The mill supervisor nodded approvingly, and Clara's heart sank. The 6-month window was clearly designed to target her specifically while exempting everyone else. Are there any other perspectives the council should hear? Charles asked, though his tone suggested this was a formality. Agnes Morton stood immediately. I have something to say. Edwin's framing this as protection for established merchants, but I am an established merchant, and I don't want this protection. Clara Whitmore has brought customers to my store who wouldn't have come otherwise. She buys fabric, thread, buttons, and supplies from me weekly. Her business has been good for my business. She's stealing your ready-made clothing sales, Edwin interjected. I never carried much ready-made clothing because there wasn't demand for quality work, Agnes shot back. Clara provides a service I can't and don't want to provide. She complements my business rather than competing with it. Margaret Chen stood next. My husband's general store has seen the same benefit. Clara purchases lamp oil, food, and household supplies. The money she earns stays in Pine Hollow instead of going to Portland dressmakers. That's good for our entire economy. One by one, Clara's supporters stood and spoke. Sarah Holbrook talked about how Clara had helped her students' families afford properly fitting clothes for growing children. A logger's wife described how Clara had repaired her husband's work clothes for half what it would have cost to replace them. Patricia Winters spoke about the quality of craftsmanship and professional service. Through it all, Edwin's face grew progressively darker. When the testimonials finally ended, he stood again. These are all very touching personal anecdotes, he said, voice dripping with condescension. But they don't address the fundamental issue. Miss Whitmore came to Pine Hollow under false pretenses. I came here as your invited bride, Clara heard herself say, standing without conscious decision. You rejected me publicly and humiliatingly, Mr. Hale. I chose to stay and build a life anyway. There were no false pretenses on my part. You had no right to stay without means of support. I had every right, Clara interrupted, her voice steady and clear. I'm a free woman with marketable skills. I've broken no laws, harmed no one, and contributed to this community through honest work. Your petition isn't about protecting Pine Hollow's economy. It's about punishing me for having the audacity to succeed after you tried to shame me into leaving. The room went deadly silent. Edwin's face flushed purple. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Clara's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the hall. You're a successful businessman, Mr. Hale. You own the mill, you employ half this town, you live in the biggest house in Pine Hollow. But none of that gives you the right to destroy someone's livelihood because your pride was wounded. The council needs to hear facts, not emotional. Then let me give you facts. Clara pulled out the papers she'd prepared. In 3 months, I've completed over 200 commissions. I've employed Sarah Holbrook part-time, providing income for a school teacher whose salary barely covers her expenses. I've spent $240 at local businesses. I've provided services to 47 different families, including yours, Mr. Russell. Tom Russell, sitting beside Edwin, suddenly looked very interested in his boots. I pay my rent on time. I attend church. I contribute to community events. I've broken no laws and violated no moral standards. Clara's voice softened slightly. I understand that my presence here is uncomfortable for you, Mr. Hale, but discomfort isn't grounds for economic persecution. She sat down, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Jonah reached over and squeezed her hand, his expression proud and fierce. Charles Winters looked at his fellow council members. Gentlemen, I think we need to deliberate. The meeting will recess for 15 minutes while we discuss this matter privately. The council filed into a back room, and the hall erupted in conversation. Edwin stormed out the front door without looking at anyone. Clara sat frozen, trying to read the crowd's reaction. Agnes appeared at her side. That was magnificent, absolutely magnificent. I may have made things worse, Clara whispered. No, Jonah said firmly. You told the truth. That's never making things worse. The 15 minutes felt like hours. Finally, the council returned and took their seats. Charles Winters' face was carefully neutral as he called the meeting back to order. The council has deliberated on Mr. Hale's petition, he said. While we appreciate his concern for Pine Hollow's economic stability, we find insufficient evidence that itinerant merchants pose a current threat to established businesses. Furthermore, we find that Miss Whitmore specifically has demonstrated commitment to our community and conducts her business in accordance with all existing regulations. Claire's breath caught. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? Therefore, the petition for new merchant licensing requirements is denied. Charles's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. However, we encourage Mr. Hale to bring forward any specific violations of existing laws or regulations should he become aware of them. The hall erupted in applause mixed with angry muttering from Edwin's supporters. Claire felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelming relief washing through her. "It's over," she whispered to Jonah. "For now," he agreed, "but Edwin won't give up this easily." Jonah was right. Over the next week, Edwin's retaliation took subtler forms. Suddenly, several of Clara's customers canceled commissions with vague excuses. Rumors circulated that her work was overpriced, that she used inferior materials, that she'd been rude to clients. Nothing provable, but enough to create doubt. Clara worked harder, trying to prove the rumors false through exceptional service. But the cancellations stung, both financially and emotionally. She'd thought winning the council vote would settle matters. But Edwin was demonstrating that power didn't require official sanctions. It was Jonah who finally forced the confrontation. He'd been preparing to move his operation to the Low Country for winter, but he delayed when he saw what Edwin was doing. On a gray Saturday morning, he walked into Edwin's mill office and demanded a private meeting. Clara only learned about it later when Jonah appeared at the boarding house looking grimmer than she'd ever seen him. "What did you do?" she asked, alarmed by his expression. "I gave Edwin a choice." Jonah's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "I told him he could continue his vendetta against you, or he could continue receiving my timber, but not both." Clara's stomach dropped. "Jonah, no, you can't sacrifice your business for—" "I can, and I did." His gray eyes were hard as flint. "Edwin's mill depends on quality timber. I provide the best in the region. He can find other suppliers, but they'll cost more and deliver less consistent quality. It will hurt his bottom line. And it will hurt yours too. You'll lose your biggest customer." "I have other buyers," Jonah interrupted. "Mills in Portland, independent lumber operations. I'll make less profit, sure, but I can survive it. The question is whether Edwin's willing to lose money just to keep tormenting you." "What did he say?" Jonah's expression darkened further. "He said I was a fool for throwing away profit for a woman who wasn't even my wife. He said you weren't worth the sacrifice." He paused. "I told him he was right about one thing. You're not my wife yet. But that if I had my way, you would be, and that you're worth more than any amount of timber profit." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. "You told Edwin Hale you wanted to marry me?" "I told him the truth." Jonah took her hands. "I know we said we'd go slowly, and we will. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, but Clara, you need to know, I'm in this for the long term. I want a partnership, a life together, and I won't stand by while someone tries to destroy you." Tears slid down Clara's face, but she didn't pull away. "You shouldn't have risked your business. My business isn't worth anything if I build it by watching someone I love suffer." Jonah's voice was fierce. Edwin needed to understand that there are consequences for his actions, that he can't just crush anyone who inconveniences him. "You said love," Clara whispered. Jonah went still. "I did. Is that a problem?" "No." Clara's voice was shaky. "No, it's not a problem. It's terrifying and overwhelming and completely unexpected, but it's not a problem." "Do you think you might—" Jonah started. "Yes," Clara interrupted. "I do. I think I might. I think I already do, actually, which is insane given that 3 months ago I'd never met you, but—" He kissed her, cutting off her rambling, and Clara melted into it. When they finally pulled apart, they were both grinning like fools. "Edwin's going to make a decision," Jonah said. "Either he backs off and keeps my timber contract, or he continues his vendetta and loses a significant revenue stream. Either way, he's going to know that coming after you has consequences." 2 days passed in tense waiting. Then, on Monday morning, Tom Russell appeared at Clara's door, hat in hand and looking deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Whitmore, I need to speak with you." Clara let him in warily, remembering his crude implications from weeks ago. But his demeanor was different now, subdued, almost apologetic. "Mr. Hale sent me," Tom said, staring at his boots. "He wants you to know that the rumors will stop. He's called off anyone spreading talk about your work." He paused. "And he asked me to apologize for what I said that day on Main Street. It was out of line and ungentlemanly." Clara studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine or another manipulation. "Why the change of heart?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Because Jonah Calder made it clear there would be consequences if the harassment continued. And because—" he stopped, seeming to struggle with honesty. "Because I got laid off from the mill this morning, along with 3 other men who've been spreading rumors on Edwin's behalf." "He fired you?" "He needed to cut costs," Tom said bitterly. "Losing Calder's timber contract means less work, which means fewer men needed. The 4 of us who helped him with his vendetta against you, we're the ones who got cut." He finally met her eyes. "I can't say I didn't earn it. I was cruel to you, Miss Whitmore. I'm sorry." After Tom left, Clara sat in stunned silence. Edwin had made his choice, keep the timber contract and abandon his vendetta. But in doing so, he'd punish the men who'd helped him, deflecting blame and cutting costs simultaneously. It was coldly logical and completely characteristic. When she told Jonah, he just nodded grimly. "That's Edwin. Never takes responsibility, always finds someone else to sacrifice. But the important thing is that he backed down. You're safe from his harassment." "At the cost of 4 men's jobs," Clara said quietly. 4 men who chose to participate in cruelty," Jonah corrected. "I'm sorry for their families, but they made their choices. Tom Russell wasn't forced to say those things to you on Main Street." That evening, Clara made a decision. She went to Agnes's store and purchased fabric suitable for work clothes, then spent the next 3 days sewing 4 sets of sturdy canvas pants and wool shirts. When they were finished, she wrapped them carefully and delivered them to Tom Russell's boarding house. He stared at her in confusion when she handed him the package. "What's this?" "Work clothes," Clara said, "for you and the other men who were let go. If you're going to find new jobs, you'll need decent gear. Consider it a gift." Tom opened the package, examining the quality of the work with obvious surprise. "Why would you do this after everything?" "Because you apologized," Clara said simply. "Because holding grudges takes energy I'd rather spend building my life. And because those 4 men have families who didn't do anything wrong." She turned to leave, but Tom's voice stopped her. "Miss Whitmore, I was wrong about you. You're a good person. Better than most of us deserve." Clara walked back to the boarding house feeling lighter somehow. She'd come to Pine Hollow carrying so much anger and hurt, so much defensive armor against a world that had rejected her. But standing tall didn't require hardening herself against compassion. It meant having the strength to choose grace, even when she'd earned the right to bitterness. That night, Jonah took her to dinner at the small restaurant on Main Street, a public declaration of their relationship that set tongues wagging throughout Pine Hollow. They sat across from each other at a corner table, ignoring the stares, talking about the future. "The low country operation will keep me busy through winter," Jonah said, "but I'll be in town most weekends. And I was thinking—" He hesitated. "In spring, when the high country thaws, I'd like you to see the upper camp at its best. Not for work, just to see it. To understand what I do, where I spend my time." "I'd like that," Clara said. Then, gathering her courage, "Jonah, when you told Edwin you wanted to marry me, did you mean it?" "Every word." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I know it's fast. I know we should probably court properly for a year or more. But Clara, I've never felt more certain of anything in my life." "I feel the same way," Clara admitted, "which terrifies me because I've been wrong about people before." "You weren't wrong," Jonah said gently. "Edwin showed you exactly who he was. You just hoped he might be different. But I'm showing you who I am too, every day, in every action. Judge me by what I do, not just what I say." Clara thought about that, about how Jonah had stood beside her when Edwin attacked, how he'd risked his business to protect her, how he'd never once asked her to be smaller or different or more acceptable. Actions, not words. "When this is all settled," she said softly, "when spring comes and we've had time to be sure, ask me again." Jonah's smile was like sunrise. "I will. And Clara? I already know your answer will be yes." She laughed because he was right. Somewhere between that first awkward meeting in Agnes's store and this moment, surrounded by curious stares in Pine Hollow's only restaurant, she'd fallen completely in love with a man who saw her exactly as she was and wanted her anyway. The evening ended with a walk through town, Jonah's hand warm around hers despite the cold. They passed Edwin's grand house, lights blazing in the windows, and Clara felt nothing but pity for the man inside. He had wealth and status and a house that proclaimed his importance, but he'd never understand what she and Jonah had found. Partnership built on mutual respect, love that didn't require anyone to diminish themselves. When they reached the boarding house, Jonah kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Sleep well," he murmured against her hair, "and dream about spring, when everything begins again." Clara watched him walk away, then went inside to find Maggie waiting with hot tea and an expression that demanded details. She told her everything, watching the older woman's face soften with approval. "You've come a long way from that frightened woman who stepped off the stage," Maggie said. "You should be proud of yourself." Clara thought about the journey, from Boston to Pine Hollow, from rejection to acceptance, from loneliness to love. She'd stood tall when it would have been easier to crumble, had chosen courage when fear seemed more prudent, had built something real from the wreckage of Edwin's rejection. "I am proud," she said, and realized it was true. "For the first time in my life, I'm genuinely proud of who I am." And somewhere in the darkness, Pine Hollow settled into sleep around her. A frontier town that had learned to make space for a woman who refused to shrink and had been made better for it. Winter settled over Pine Hollow like a heavy quilt, bringing snow that transformed the logging town into something almost magical. Clara watched it fall from her window each morning, marveling at how different her life looked now compared to those first desperate days in September. The tin box under her floorboard held enough money to last through spring even if work slowed. Her commissions filled a ledger that grew thicker each week. And most remarkably, she had Jonah, steady, honest Jonah, who traveled down from the low country operation every Saturday without fail, his arrival marking the rhythm of her weeks. Christmas approached with festive energy that swept through town despite the cold. The church organized a social, and for the first time, Clara attended not as an outsider, but as someone with a place in Pine Hollow's fabric. She stood with Jonah by the refreshment table, watching couples dance while children raced between the adults with the particular wildness that comes from too much sugar and excitement. "You're staring at them like they're a curiosity," Jonah observed, amusement coloring his voice. "I've never been to anything like this," Clara admitted. "In Boston, I worked Christmas Day and went to bed early. This feels like something from a storybook." Jonah's expression softened. He set down his cup and offered his hand. "Dance with me." Clara hesitated. "I'm not very good, and everyone will stare." "Everyone already stares. Might as well give them something worth looking at." They moved onto the floor just as the musicians started a waltz. Jonah led with surprising grace for a man who worked with his hands, and Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm. They were the tallest couple on the floor by several inches, but for once it felt like an advantage rather than a liability. They fit together in a way that seemed almost inevitable. "I got you something," Jonah said quietly as they turned. "For Christmas. But I want to give it to you privately, not here." "I made you something too," Clara confessed. "A new shirt. The one you wear every Saturday is getting threadbare." "You didn't have to. I wanted to." She met his eyes. "You've given me so much, Jonah. Let me give you something back." After the dance ended, they slipped outside into the cold night air. Snow crunched under their boots as they walked toward Jonah's cabin, their breath making clouds in the moonlight. Inside, Jonah lit the fire while Clara settled into the chair that had become hers over the past months, the one by the window where she'd sit and sew while he read aloud from his small library of books. "Close your eyes," Jonah said when the fire was crackling. Clara obeyed, hearing him move across the room and return. "All right, you can look." In his hands was a wooden box, beautifully crafted from what looked like bird's eye maple. The lid had been carved with an intricate pattern of pine trees and mountains, and when Clara lifted it, the interior was lined with green velvet. Small compartments held spools of thread in every color imaginable, and there were slots for needles, scissors, measuring tape, everything a seamstress might need, organized with thoughtful precision. "Jonah," she breathed, "this is extraordinary. Where did you—" "I made it," he said, looking almost shy. "Nights at the camp when the men were playing cards or drinking. I wanted you to have something that showed I understand what your work means to you, that I respect it." Clara ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the care in every joint and curve. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." "You deserve beautiful things." Jonah knelt beside her chair. "Clara, I know we said we'd wait until spring, but I need to say this now. These past months with you have been the best of my life. Not because anything's easier, it's actually more complicated in a lot of ways, but because everything matters more. Food tastes better when I'm thinking about telling you about my day. Work feels more purposeful, knowing I'm coming back to you. Even the hard things, Edwin's vendetta, the town gossip, all of it, even that feels manageable because I'm not facing it alone anymore." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "I feel the same way." "Then marry me." The words came out rushed, urgent. "I know it's early. I know people will talk about how we barely know each other. But Clara, I know everything that matters. I know you're brave and skilled and kinder than you need to be. I know you stand up for what's right, even when it costs you. I know you make me want to be better than I am." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's. It's the only thing I have from my family. I want you to have it. I want you to be my family." Clara looked at the ring, then at Jonah's face, open, honest, hopeful. Every cautious instinct told her this was too fast, too risky, that she should wait and be sensible. But those same instincts had kept her small and afraid for 28 years. And where had that gotten her? "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Jonah's face broke into a grin that transformed him from serious foreman to someone almost boyish with joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her hand, and then he was kissing her with a fierce tenderness that made the world outside the cabin cease to exist. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and laughing, Clara said, "We should probably tell people, before the gossip gets ahead of us." "Let them gossip," Jonah said. "But yes, we'll tell people. Starting with Maggie, who'll box my ears if she hears it secondhand." They walked back to the boarding house through snow that had begun falling again, soft flakes catching in Clara's hair and on Jonah's coat. Maggie took one look at their faces and started laughing. "About time," she said. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around it until spring actually arrived." Then she saw the ring, and her expression softened. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm so happy for you." The news spread through Pine Hollow faster than Clara would have thought possible. By Sunday service, everyone knew, and the reactions ranged from genuine happiness to skeptical disapproval to barely concealed jealousy from women who'd hoped to catch Jonah themselves. Edwin Hale's face when he saw them together in church was a study in suppressed fury, but he said nothing. His defeat at the council meeting and the loss of Jonah's timber contract had taught him the limits of his power, and he seemed to have decided that silent resentment was safer than open warfare. After the service, Patricia Winters cornered Clara with uncharacteristic warmth. "I'm pleased for you both. Jonah Calder is one of the few truly good men in this territory, and you've proven yourself more than worthy of him." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. That means a great deal." "I assume you'll continue your work after marriage?" Patricia's tone made it clear this was important. "Of course. Jonah would never ask me to stop." "Good. We need women like you in Pine Hollow, women who show the younger generation that capability and independence are things to be proud of, not ashamed of." Patricia paused. "My daughter is 13. She's already nearly 6 feet tall, and she's miserable about it. But she sees you walking through town with your head high, running a successful business, choosing a partner who values you as an equal. That matters more than you might realize." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought about it that way." "You should. You're changing things just by refusing to apologize for existing. That's revolutionary whether you intended it or not. They decided on a simple ceremony in late January, to be held at the church with just close friends and townspeople. Clara had no family to invite. Her sister in Boston had stopped responding to letters months ago, but that hurt less than she'd expected. The family she'd found in Pine Hollow felt more real than blood ties ever had. Sarah and Emma helped her make a wedding dress in deep blue wool, practical enough for frontier life but beautiful in its simplicity. Clara insisted on sewing most of it herself, wanting the marriage to start with something she'd created with her own skilled hands. The weeks before the wedding passed in happy chaos. Clara finished outstanding commissions, organized her business so Sarah could manage it during a brief honeymoon, and planned the small reception Maggie insisted on hosting at the boarding house. Jonah arranged for 2 weeks away from the logging operation and managed the endless logistics of combining their separate lives into one shared future. They decided to live in Jonah's cabin initially, with plans to expand it in spring. Clara would maintain her workspace at the boarding house, where clients knew to find her, and where Sarah could assist. It wasn't traditional, but nothing about their relationship had been traditional from the start. 3 days before the wedding, Clara was finishing the hem on her dress when a knock interrupted her concentration. She opened the door to find a young woman she didn't recognize, barely 20, thin and exhausted looking, with a carpet bag clutched in one hand and fear in her eyes. "Are you Clara Whitmore?" the woman asked. "Yes. Can I help you?" "My name is Ruth Miller. I came from Sacramento on the stage. I'm supposed to meet a man named James Porter. He sent for me as his bride. But when I arrived, he took one look at me and said I was too plain, too skinny, not what he expected." Her voice cracked. "He left me at the stage office with no money and nowhere to go." Clara's stomach clenched with recognition. She saw herself in this terrified woman, saw the same public rejection, the same desperate uncertainty, the same awful moment when everything you'd gambled on crumbled to nothing. "Come inside," she said gently. "You're not alone, and you're not without options." Over tea, Ruth told her story. 20 years old, orphaned young, working as a seamstress in Sacramento for barely enough to survive. James Porter's letters had promised a home, security, a chance at something better. The journey had taken her last penny, and now she was stranded in a strange town with a man who'd rejected her on sight. "I don't know what to do," Ruth whispered. "I can't go back. There's nothing to go back to." Clara thought about that first terrible day in Pine Hollow, standing in the town square with her dignity in tatters, and her future uncertain. She thought about Agnes Morton's practical kindness and Maggie Brennan's offer of a room. She thought about all the people who'd given her chances when they didn't have to. "You stay here," she said firmly. "In my room. I'm getting married in 3 days and moving to my husband's cabin. The room is paid through the end of the month, and Maggie won't object if you take it over after that." "I can't afford—" "You said you're a seamstress?" Clara interrupted. Ruth nodded. "Then you can work. I have more commissions than I can handle alone. You can assist me, learn the clients, and eventually take on your own projects. You'll earn enough to pay rent and support yourself." Ruth stared at her. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "Because someone did it for me," Clara said simply. "And because no woman should have to face what we've faced alone. You're not playing, Ruth. You're not too skinny. You're exactly who you're supposed to be, and any man who can't see that is a fool." By the time Jonah arrived that evening, Clara had installed Ruth in her room, introduced her to Maggie and the Holbrook sisters, and begun explaining the business operations she'd be teaching her. Jonah listened to the whole story, then smiled. "You're building something bigger than a business, aren't you? You're building a network for women who don't fit the mold." "I'm just helping someone who needs it," Clara protested. "No, it's more than that." Jonah pulled her close. "You're showing women that rejection isn't the end, that they can build lives on their own terms. That's powerful, Clara." The day of the wedding dawned cold and brilliant, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Clara dressed with Sarah and Emma's help, her hands surprisingly steady as she pinned her hair and fastened the buttons on her blue dress. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized, a woman confident and beloved, standing tall without apology. The church was full when she arrived, more people than she'd expected. It seemed all of Pine Hollow had turned out, curiosity and genuine goodwill mixed in equal measure. Jonah stood at the altar looking almost nervous, his Sunday suit clean and pressed, his hair ruthlessly combed. Agnes Morton walked Clara down the aisle. Neither of them had fathers, so it seemed right that Clara's first true friend in Pine Hollow should have the honor. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but weighted with meaning Clara had never expected to feel. I, Clara, take you, Jonah, to be my husband, to stand beside you as an equal partner, to build a life based on honesty, respect, and love, for as long as we both shall live. I, Jonah, take you, Clara, to be my wife, to honor your strength and independence, to support your dreams and celebrate your successes, to love you exactly as you are, for as long as we both shall live. When the minister pronounced them married, Jonah kissed her with a sweetness that made the congregation murmur approvingly. They walked back down the aisle together, past faces ranging from genuinely happy to grudgingly accepting, and Clara didn't care about any of it. She'd found what she'd come west looking for, not a husband to complete her, but a partner to walk beside her. The reception at Maggie's was loud and joyful, with food and music and dancing that lasted until late evening. Even Sheriff Morrison made a brief appearance, toasting the couple with surprising eloquence. The only notable absence was Edwin Hale, who'd made a point of leaving town for business the week of the wedding. As the party wound down, Clara found herself talking with Ruth, who'd stayed mostly in the background but seemed to be absorbing everything with wide eyes. "This is what's possible," Clara said quietly. "When you refuse to let rejection define you. When you build something on your own terms and find people who value you for who you are." "I want that," Ruth said. "I want to be like you." "Then be yourself," Clara corrected. "Be completely, unapologetically yourself. That's what I learned here. Not to be like anyone else, but to stop trying to be smaller than I am." Jonah appeared to collect his bride, and they said their goodbyes amid teasing and well-wishes. The walk to Jonah's cabin, their cabin now, felt momentous, the beginning of something Clara had stopped believing was possible for someone like her. Inside, Jonah built up the fire while Clara stood at the window looking out at Pine Hollow's scattered lights. "I keep thinking about that first day," she said, "standing in the town square, humiliated and alone. If someone had told me I'd end up here, married to a good man, running a successful business, actually happy, I would have thought they were cruel for giving me false hope." Jonah came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You created this, Clara. Not luck, not fate. You made the choice to stand your ground and build something instead of running away. That took more courage than most people ever manage." "I was terrified the whole time." "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." He turned her to face him. "You're the bravest person I know." That night, Clara lay in Jonah's arms in their marriage bed and felt a peace she'd never experienced before. Not because all her problems were solved, she knew there would be challenges ahead, knew that some people would never fully accept her, knew that life in Pine Hollow would continue to be complicated, but she'd proven she could handle challenges. She'd built a foundation strong enough to weather storms. Winter gave way slowly to early spring, and Clara's business flourished beyond even her optimistic projections. With Ruth's help, she took on larger projects, outfitting entire logging crews, creating wardrobes for wealthy families, even shipping custom garments to customers in Portland who'd heard of her quality. The money accumulated faster than she could spend it, and she began to dream bigger. "What if we built something permanent?" she asked Jonah one evening. "A real shop on Main Street, with room for multiple seamstresses. We could employ women who need work, teach them the trade, create something that lasts beyond just my individual commissions." Jonah looked up from the logging contract he'd been reviewing. "You're talking about a real business, with employees and overhead and significant investment." "I know it's ambitious. It's brilliant," Jonah interrupted, "and completely achievable. You've proven the demand exists. Clara, you could build something that changes opportunities for women throughout this region." They spent the next weeks planning. Jonah helped with financial projections and construction logistics, drawing on his business experience. Agnes offered advice about managing inventory and customer relations. Even Patricia Winters contributed ideas about marketing to wealthy clientele. By late March, Clara had secured a property, a former dry goods store whose owner had retired. The space needed renovation, but the bones were solid and the location perfect. She hired local workers to handle the construction, insisting on fair wages that raised eyebrows but earned respect. The grand opening was scheduled for May, and Clara threw herself into preparations with an energy that surprised even her. She hired 3 more seamstresses, all women who'd faced some form of rejection or difficulty, all skilled and hungry for opportunity. She taught them her techniques, shared her customer relationships, and built something that felt less like a business and more like a family. Edwin Hale watched all this with visible frustration, but he'd learned his lesson about confronting Clara directly. Instead, he focused on his mill and nursing his resentment in private. The town had moved on from the scandal of his rejected bride, more interested in Clara's success than his failure. One warm April afternoon, a familiar carriage rolled into Pine Hollow. Clara was working in her soon-to-be-completed shop when Sarah burst in, breathless. "Clara, you need to come see this. There's a woman asking for you. She came all the way from Boston." Clara's heart stuttered. Boston meant her sister, and her sister meant judgment and resentment and all the reasons Clara had left in the first place. But curiosity drew her to the door, where she found not her sister but her former employer from the dressmaker's shop, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, looking impossibly elegant and completely out of place in frontier Pine Hollow. "Clara Whitmore," Mrs. Hartwell said, her sharp eyes taking in everything from Clara's practical work dress to her wedding ring to the building under construction behind her. "Or should I say Mrs. Calder now?" "Mrs. Hartwell, this is unexpected." "I imagine so." The older woman's expression was unreadable. "May we speak privately?" They went to Maggie's, settling in the parlor with tea while Clara tried to understand why her former employer had traveled 2,000 miles. "I received a letter from a customer in Portland," Mrs. Hartwell began. She described an extraordinary dressmaker in Oregon Territory who'd made her a traveling suit of unprecedented quality. She included a sketch. "I recognized your work immediately. That particular way you construct sleeve caps, the signature gathering technique you developed. Clara, I trained you for 10 years, and you were always talented, but this work has surpassed anything you did in my employ." "Thank you," Clara said carefully, "though I'm not sure why you've come all this way to tell me that." "Because I want to propose a partnership." Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward. "I have the reputation and client connections of Boston's finest dressmaker. You have exceptional skill and apparently the ability to build something remarkable even in frontier conditions. Together, we could create a business that spans from East Coast to West." Clara stared at her. "You want to partner with me? The woman you paid barely enough to survive? The woman whose height you said would frighten customers?" Mrs. Hartwell had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was wrong about that, and perhaps I undervalued your contributions because you were young and unsure of yourself. But Clara, you're different now. You carry yourself with confidence I never saw in Boston. You've built something real. I'm offering you a chance to expand it beyond Oregon, to reach customers who would pay premium prices for your quality." It was everything Clara might have dreamed of 3 years ago. Validation from the woman who'd employed her, recognition of her skills, opportunity to build something truly significant. But as she sat in Maggie's comfortable parlor, wearing the wedding ring that symbolized her new life, she realized the offer held no appeal. "I appreciate the recognition, Mrs. Hartwell. Truly. But I'm not interested in a partnership." "You're refusing?" "Clara, the income potential alone—" "I don't need income potential," Clara interrupted gently. "I have a thriving business here, a husband I love, a community I'm part of. I'm building something that matters to me, not just making money but creating opportunities for women who've been overlooked and rejected like I was. That's worth more than any Boston partnership could offer." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. "You've changed." "I've grown," Clara corrected. "I've learned my worth, and I've learned that success isn't about impressing people who once undervalued me. It's about building a life I'm proud of." After Mrs. Hartwell left, disappointed but grudgingly respectful, Clara walked back to her shop. Jonah was there, checking the progress on the new cutting tables. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set down his tools. "What happened?" She told him about the offer, watching understanding dawn on his face. "Do you regret saying no?" he asked. "Not for a second." Clara moved into his arms, feeling the solid certainty of him. This is where I belong. Not trying to prove myself to people who'll never fully accept me, but building something real with people who value me exactly as I am. The shop opened in May to crowds that exceeded Clara's expectations. Women came from Pine Hollow and surrounding territories, drawn by reputation and the novelty of a woman-owned business that specialized in difficult fittings and custom work. The seamstresses Clara had hired proved talented and dedicated, and within weeks they were working at capacity. On a warm June evening, Clara locked the shop door and walked home. The words still new enough to make her smile. To the cabin she and Jonah had expanded over spring. The addition included a proper bedroom and a workroom where Clara could design and plan without the noise of the main shop. Jonah was already there, cooking supper with the focused competence he brought to everything. Clara wrapped her arms around him from behind, breathing in the smell of pine and wood smoke that clung to him even after he'd washed. "Good day?" he asked. "Extraordinary day. We took 14 new commissions. Ruth finished her first solo project, and the customer was thrilled, and I think we might need to hire another seamstress by autumn." "That's wonderful." Jonah turned to kiss her properly. "I have news too. The high country operation is doing well enough that I can afford to hire another foreman for the summer season, which means I'll be home more often." "Home," Clara repeated, tasting the word. "I never thought I'd have a home that felt like this. Safe and chosen and exactly right." "You built it," Jonah reminded her. "You could have run back to Boston when Edwin rejected you. You could have accepted defeat and disappeared. Instead, you stood your ground and built something remarkable." That night, lying in bed with moonlight streaming through the window and Jonah's breathing steady beside her, Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Pine Hollow as a rejected bride, desperate and humiliated, carrying nothing but pride and determination. She'd faced down prejudice and cruelty, had built a business through skill and persistence, had found love with a man who valued her exactly as she was. But more than any of that, she'd found herself. The Clara who'd boarded the stage in Boston had been a woman shaped by others' expectations, constantly apologizing for taking up space, believing she was too much for anyone to truly want. The Clara who lay here now was someone different, confident, capable, unapologetically tall, building a life on her own terms. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were still people in Pine Hollow who whispered about her, still moments when old insecurities tried to surface. But Clara had learned that standing tall wasn't about being perfect or universally liked. It was about refusing to shrink for anyone's comfort, about claiming her space in the world and building something worthy of the woman she'd become. As summer deepened and her business continued to thrive, Clara began to see the ripple effects of her presence in Pine Hollow. More women started businesses, a bakery run by two sisters, a bookshop owned by a widow who'd been told she should remarry rather than work. Young girls walked with straighter spines, tall girls stopped slouching to hide their height. Ruth bloomed from terrified to confident, taking on larger projects and even beginning to teach newer seamstresses. Edwin Hale faded from the center of Pine Hollow's attention, his importance diminished by his own pettiness. The mill still operated, but other businesses grew around it, diversifying the town's economy. Clara occasionally saw him on the street and offered polite nods that he rarely returned. She felt no triumph in his diminishment, no satisfaction in his isolation. She simply felt grateful that his rejection had freed her to find something infinitely better than becoming his decoration. On a brilliant September morning, exactly 1 year after she'd first arrived in Pine Hollow, Clara stood outside her shop and looked at the sign Sarah had painted, Whitmore and Company, fine tailoring and dressmaking. Her name, her company, her life. Jonah appeared beside her, sliding an arm around her waist. "Happy anniversary." "Of the worst day of my life becoming the best thing that ever happened to me," Clara said, laughing. "Edwin Hale did us a favor in the end." "He really did." Clara leaned into her husband's warmth, though I doubt he sees it that way. They stood together watching Pine Hollow wake up, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school, wagons rolling down Main Street loaded with timber and goods, and the commerce of frontier life. Clara saw her reflection in the shop window, a tall woman in a well-made dress, standing beside an equally tall man, both of them looking utterly at home. She thought about writing to her sister in Boston, letting her know how wrong she'd been about Clara's prospects, but the urge faded as quickly as it came. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The life she'd built was proof enough. "Ready to go home?" Jonah asked. Clara smiled, taking his hand. "Always." They walked together through the town that had rejected her, and then accepted her and finally celebrated her, past the spot where Edwin had publicly humiliated her, past the boarding house where Maggie had given her a chance, past Agnes's store where kindness had first shown its face. Every step was history. Every building held a memory of building herself back up from nothing. And as the autumn sun climbed higher over Pine Hollow, Clara Whitmore Calder walked with her head high and her heart full. A woman who'd learned that sometimes rejection was just the universe making space for something better. She'd come west looking for acceptance and found something far more valuable: the courage to accept herself, the strength to stand tall, and the wisdom to know that she had always been exactly enough. She was home,